All right, well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for sticking it out this afternoon. You all get your own table. So what I'm presenting on is a project we call Zeke. It's a Python platform for teaching the mathematical modeling of infectious diseases. So kind of getting acknowledgments out of the way, a lot of this was done in collaboration with a guy named Alex Clark. He's one of the guys who maintains Pillow, among other things, but for me, he was just someone who was working on the web front end. And the funding for this, my postdoc, I'm at the Network Dynamics and Simulation Science Institute at Virginia Tech, lab, not institute, at Virginia Tech, and that's funded by the NIH. And then a lot of this was actually funded by Merck through the Investigator-Initiated Studies program. So my background, I'm a computational epidemiologist. What that means is I simulate the outbreak of infectious diseases. I work mostly in hospital epidemiology, some emerging infectious diseases, but primarily hospital epi. And my background is from a school of public health, a traditional observational epidemiology department, where we go, we collect data on people, we analyze that data to look for particular risk factors, mainly using statistics. So this meant I got a lot of stats and very little programming. So Zeke is actually in many ways me trying to retrace my steps, going from essentially a second-year graduate student who had never really used Python to where I am right now. In terms of language usage and kind of the background of people I'm targeting for this, this is an informal survey of the papers in the two major epidemiology journals, Epidemiology and the American Journal of Epidemiology, published this year that report what software they used. How many SAS users do we have in the room? Okay, so more than I expected. So most of the papers in AJE and epidemiology were written in SAS, followed by Stata, followed by R. Not a single one was written in Python. So assuming Python knowledge is kind of an unsafe assumption when we're looking at teaching epidemiology students. There's some very rational reasons for that. If you're doing mainly statistics, mainly statistical languages are probably a better choice. But a lot of these languages are kind of utterly impractical for trying to teach mathematical modeling in. I'm sure it's theoretically possible to make a mathematical model in SAS. I don't want to try it. Stata, I can't even think of how I do that. So we have to move towards some of these more general purpose programming languages, but at the same time, none of our students have any experience in them. So as a disclaimer, there's not going to be any brilliant new Python written today. In fact, the goal of Zeke is not to write brilliant new Python. It's to present something using very stable, very well supported libraries, so things like SciPy, NumPy, Django, things that if somebody loses grant funding or gets tired of maintaining the project, Zeke won't break. If SciPy breaks, that's a problem, but I think that's a problem for everybody in the room. So, for example, there's no pip install Zeke or from Zeke import. If you want to see bespoke epidemiology-centric Python code, Caitlin Rivers is giving a talk on her package EpiPy on Thursday. You should go to it. So a brief introduction to mathematical models in epidemiology. Bernoulli started out in 1760 with a mathematical model of smallpox. For those of you who know the history of epidemiology, that well predates John Snow, so-called founder of epidemiology. And its really modern incarnation takes off in the 1900s with people like Ross, Reed, Frost, working on various and sundry public health problems of the day. And it's really an invaluable tool in modern public health. It can illustrate really difficult concepts. So herd immunity, which is a pretty difficult concept to get your head around. That's the idea that if a certain amount of the population is immune, essentially everyone is effectively immune. That's really difficult to just explain to people. Using a mathematical model, it's actually relatively easy to just show. And then looking at things like competing or complementary interventions. So if you ask, should we increase screening for this disease, or should we try to deploy a vaccine, or should we just tell everybody not to, sneeze on each other? What are the effects of those? Those can be looked at mathematically, where it's often very hard to do that statistically. And it allows us to do quantitative research on public health questions that are difficult, expensive, or otherwise infeasible. So it's really hard to do studies on pandemics because they only come around once, and you can't really ethically say, okay, so if I give, the entire city of Austin Ebola, what happens? The IRB will shut that down. You can, however, ask that mathematically and take a look at some possible interventions. But then the question becomes, how do we teach modeling, and how do we approach teaching modeling? And in public health, the emphasis is on the interpretation and composition of models. So essentially, it's taught as what happens when you encounter a model in the literature. So you understand how to make them, you can kind of write down the differential equations, you can write down a flow chart for the model, but actually how to make the model, how to get results, that's largely left as a black box. So essentially you say, and then magic happens, and out come these curves, and these are what these curves mean. Math, on the other hand, tends to teach the mathematical analysis of epidemiologic models as a dynamical systems problem. This creates kind of a constellation of issues for everybody. The public health students have only a kind of loose idea of what it takes to actually build a model, so they will often come up with extremely complicated models that are kind of a nightmare to implement, or even if they have an idea for a model, they have no idea how to get started. Math students, on the other hand, tend to then be focused on abstract or mathematically interesting points that may not have any bearing on public health. And everybody has a two-part learning curve, a composition of either programming, theory, or infectious diseases. So everybody has the theory part. You have to learn how epidemic models work. And then for the public health students, you also need to learn how to program. For the kind of applied math students, you also have to learn a bunch of information about a half dozen diseases. And this is kind of a daunting challenge for anybody. So if you compare that to observational epi, we have this kind of disease-agnostic general toolkit called statistics. You need very little subject matter expertise. You can get through essentially an entire doctoral program saying, okay, so disease D is associated to exposure E with covariates X1, X2, and X3. And indeed, if you become a biostatistician, you can have an entire career doing exactly that. So you can build this solid foundation without ever expecting to know specific things about a disease. In contrast, mathematical models are assertions about the natural world. So they're very, very disease specific. There's a very high level of subject matter expertise required to design a model. And what this means is that they're often frequently borrowed, adapted, or modified, often incorrectly. I call this modeling by analogy. So you do things like, well, malaria is an infectious disease spread by mosquitoes, so I'm going to adapt the malaria model I learned to dengue, which is also a mosquito disease. And then I'm also going to adapt it to yellow fever, which is a mosquito disease. And then if I pretend that nurses are like mosquitoes, I'm going to model a hospital-acquired infection. And this is not actually a contrived example. The dominant model for hospital epidemiology is called the Ross-McDonald model, and it was designed for malaria control. The solution to this is zombies. I'll go into why. So why zombies? Zombies are a flexible, familiar disease system. You can become an expert in a night of movies and about $10 from Redbox. You can change model forms without changing the parameters. So essentially you can start messing with how you define this fictional epidemic and say, okay, so if we keep all our parameters constant, but we add a latent class, so there's a little bit of time between you get bitten and when you turn into a zombie, or we start having people quarantined or vaccinated, you can ask all these hypothetical questions without also changing the underlying disease system. So rather than if you switch from a model that has an incubation period to one that doesn't, you've not only switched model form, but you've changed the actual disease. In this case, all you're doing is changing model form. So basically the entire point of this project is to reduce the number of moving parts at one time to hopefully a single number, so that you can really see what happens each and every time you change something. So Zeke, the actual project, is a web-based epidemic modeling interface. It's designed to hide Python unless you're interested in the Python code. And it separates disease knowledge, programming skill, and theoretical skills development. So you don't have to know particular diseases unless you've never seen a zombie movie. You don't have to know how to program Python, and you don't really have to understand anything about how epidemics work to begin with. And as much as possible, the models themselves, the infrastructure, and the interface are kept separate as actual code elements. So for example, the models work entirely as just standalone models. You can go into the code base for Zeke, cut and paste the model into IPython notebook, run it, and you have a working model. And then you can use matplotlib or whatever you want to then plot it. So how this works in terms of an infrastructure project is you go to the server. Currently it's an Amazon EC2 server that has a Django front end to it. You select the model, you give it parameters. This is then fed into models.py, which takes the parameters you used. In the case right now, it does entirely numerical integration of ODEs. There's a dispatch function that determines whether it'll be solved locally or remotely. Right now, everything is local because, honestly, numeric ODE solvers are pretty fast at this point. For some things we're looking at in the future, it might be dispatched to kind of a secondary computation server or something like multivac. The results of that then get fit to a series of matplotlib plotting functions, which are then hosted back to the user. So the most perilous part of any talk, the live demo, which does not depend on the hotel wireless. So this is what Zeke currently looks like. It starts out, we just have about and contact, things like that, but the main is this model control process. So this is a basic, what's known as an SIR model. So you have 3 classes: survivors. In most epidemiology, this is people who are susceptible; zombies, or people who are infected, and either recovered or removed, depending on the disease you're talking about. In this case, it's people who have unfortunately died. You get this curve, and then you can change the curve. So it takes a couple different parameters. These are kind of standard parameters in mathematical modeling. So if we make the disease slightly worse, it's not going to host. Why not? Oh, that's why. Okay, there we go. So you see the epidemic curve changed. It moved from kind of over here to over here. This is a much sharper, much faster epidemic. So you can kind of interrogate those things in real time without ever having to go to the code. You can switch what type of model you use. So for example, here we add a latent class. These are people who've been bitten but not yet turned into zombies. And you can get much more complicated models. The one that we've loaded so far is an example that we call Haven. And this is kind of a generic zombie movie model that also has some application to public health practice, because this is something like people reach some sort of aid station or start engaging in social distancing or something that protects them from getting infected. So basically what happens here is the people who are survivors at the beginning of the epidemic take a little while to find somewhere safe. Once they are safe, they mix with zombies at a much, much lower rate than people who are kind of out in the wild. They can get bitten and turn into zombies, but also importantly, when they interact with zombies, there's a possibility that they will kill the zombie instead of the zombie biting them. So this is something like if you have actual treatment. And the reason I like this model is, first of all, with kind of the default things, you essentially get the plot of Day of the Dead, or really most zombie movies. You have this kind of brief thing where everyone's running around trying to find shelter. Everyone finds shelter, and for most of the movie, they're safe. The zombies reach some critical threshold towards the climax of the movie. All kinds of people die, and then we end. So I like this both because it's a model that replicates a Hollywood script, but also, more importantly, because it shows, I think, a really good illustration of how sensitive some of these models are to parameter choices. So this value kappa here is the probability that when a safe survivor meets a zombie, that the zombie ends up dying. If you change this just a little bit, the epidemic is completely different in that it never happens. So essentially we have this brief thing where everybody runs to the nearest aid shelter, and that works perfectly. So you can see with that, students can get an idea of how sensitive models are to some of those choices in again, a way that doesn't actually require all that much subject matter expertise. So that's Zeke for now. These are screenshots in case that didn't work. So the future directions, this is a very new project. If you visit the repo, it became public in April, and the SciPy cleanup commits were essentially a day before this. So the first goal is to add more models. We have some more models implemented, things like quarantine, social isolation, stochastic models. So all of these models are valid for large populations. We'd like to be able to have people look at small populations, the kind of random chance aspect of things. Curve fitting, so essentially feeding Zeke data and having it give you the fitted model out. And then network or agent-based models, so essentially expanding the amount of space that you can explore as a student without actually being exposed to code, unless you want to be exposed to code, at which point it's all on GitHub. Documentation and testing, right now there are no tests and there is no documentation. We're going to try to fix that. And then the idea really is to adapt this kind of web-based modeling framework to non-technical users as a general concept. So right now, Zeke is meant as a platform for teaching modeling. This can also be used in fields that use models like this. So two good examples are epidemiology and ecology. There are definitely others that are designed for non-technical users to be able to look at modeling results, to be able to interrogate models and get results back without actually being exposed to the underlying computational machinery. The inspirational quote for this was from a very dear collaborator of mine who, when trying to schedule a meeting, said, "My computer doesn't work with Doodle." Going from that to, well, install Anaconda, go to GitHub, clone a repo, that's a pretty steep learning curve. So it's much easier to just say, okay, go to this website, ask your question, hit submit, a picture will come back. That's kind of the level we'd like to work at, rather than expecting computational skill from non-technical users who just want to be able to ask a very basic question about a model and get an answer back. If you would like to help with this, we're always looking for contributors. One of the things Zeke is meant for is to essentially be this kind of rabbit hole of computational science where you can go as deep as you want to get. You can do almost nothing and just kind of use the framework as it exists. You can look at the code and try to make your own models in Python. You can make your own models in Python and commit it to GitHub. You can host it as a server. And it's meant to be a very approachable project for new open source contributors. The code is pretty clear. It's not using particularly esoteric packages. There's no C. There's no Fortran. And the nice part is that you only have to work on the bits you want to work on. So the GitHub repository for this is github.com/epimodels/Zeke. There's also currently a live deployment at zeke-project.org. It's a couple days out of date, so it's actually got some things in it that I have stripped out, like you have to log in for the safe haven model. You don't have to do that anymore. And thank you very much. My contact information is here. There's one specifically for kind of the Zeke project, and then my general contact information, my Twitter handle, and the GitHub repo again for the actual Zeke project. And then this was also used to teach kind of a learning institute, a one-day lecture course at the American Public Health Association's annual conference in 2012. So if you want to see the slides from that, we've got some more models implemented. They're also implemented in R. That's at github.com/myname/zombies.
Is this mostly for, this is not for a simulation-based approach, right? This is solely for a modeling-based approach? Does that make sense?
By modeling, you mean systems of ordinary differential equations?
Yes, as opposed to simulating individual people.
So right now, as implemented, the answer to that is yes. One of the goals is to add those kind of things in. They are, however, somewhat more computationally complex. So I don't, for example, want to both simulate an epidemic and host a website on the same EC2 microserver. So figuring out some things like that, I'm looking at, there's a service called Multivac that essentially ships it out kind of without exposing you to EC2 code or having a dedicated computation server. But one of the goals is to extend it to a simulation approach, because even simulation models, if you're only talking about trying to model 100 individuals or something like that, is fairly lightweight. So the goal is in the future, no. Currently, yes. If you'd like to open a pull request and fix that, please do.
So, sort of carrying on the theme of the rest of this, do you see this as having a place to teach people how to program the models?
Yeah, so the goal behind it is specifically to keep the model code as its own independent freestanding idea. So if you wanted to learn just how to make the safe haven model, you can go to the repo, go to models.py, and there's a function called safe haven. And if you just cut and paste that, you have the code for it, and it'll work in IPython or regular Python or whatever you want to do. So the idea is essentially you can go as deep as you want to go. You can expose yourself to the code, implement a new model, try it out, or you can just accept that these exist in the world and run them and see what happens when you change parameters. So yeah, the goal is to essentially to let people step into that. So as they're learning the theory, as they get a little more bold, they can try, well, what if I add a class to this model? And you can kind of compare the different models to see how that works and how that's implemented. So yeah, it's a goal both for teaching programming and teaching theory and teaching some disease knowledge without having to have any of those happen simultaneously.
Have you ever compared the results to this to agent-based models, something like NetLoad goes down a zombie model?
So I haven't compared it to the other zombie models because there's some question about how many of those are implemented. Generally speaking, the question of how ODE-based models compare to something like agent-based models is an active and unresolved question in the field. The lab I'm actually in does large-scale agent-based simulation, so the answer is yes, but again, not here. But that may be one of the things we're interested in looking at is, for example, if we implement the same model using a network, an ODE-based approach, and an agent-based model, you can look at the results of all three of those and say, man, these are really different, or they turn out to be roughly the same, and start looking at kind of circumstances where that is, again, without having to code your own ODE model, network model, and agent-based model. You can start asking those questions without knowing that. Anyone else? All right, thank you very much.